So welcome to Thinking with the Stars. I'm your host, Soul Cancer, and today I'm going to be talking about interviews that occurred in Jeffrey Mishlov's Thinking Aloud channel while Mercury was in a square aspect with Lilith. And over the past 3 months, or I guess the past 2 months, Mercury was in retrograde, and Mercury's made a square to Lilith 3 times. So on the 14th of January, on the 15th of February, Mercury was in retrograde, and then on the 1st of March, Mercury made a square aspect with Lilith. So over the past, say, Mercury has a fairly quick orbit, and Lilith, Lilith is actually a mathematical construct, and it's based on the apogee of the moon. So it actually, Lilith that we're talking about is called the black moon, and it doesn't refer to a astrological body at all. It's a mathematical equation, which I guess at one point they had conjectured that must exist in order to keep the moon in balance. But in reality, there's nothing there. It's just a mathematical equation. But we can even think of, it's interesting because we're talking about the significance of things that don't exist. And I mean, that's what don't exist materially, okay? But if they're a mathematical construct, then yeah, they could be said to exist. I mean, I guess everything exists. So it's just maybe more difficult to prove. So first I'm going to be talking about, I'm actually not going through them chronologically. I'm trying to get a more, I'm calling it ideological, but a flow that's going to be kind of jumping around all over the place, but is actually going to make more sense as I'm talking about it. Try to connect the ideas a lot tighter than I have been when I'm going through chronologically. I'm going to be bouncing because here I found that there is one single theme in the three times. So it was 26th of February 2017, Mercury was in Pisces, and it was square to Lilith that was in Sagittarius. And at this time, Jeffrey was sitting down with Kate Montana, and they did 2 interviews, one called The Ego and Its Matrix, the other one called Ego and Enlightenment. So there, just briefly, Kate is talking about there's a physical self and there's a higher self, okay, so the duality there, and she's talking a lot about the attempt to destroy the ego and find enlightenment. So that's kind of like the mission. You destroy your ego, find enlightenment, and it's all gravy, you know. So that's one kind of major theme. And then on the 14th of October 2018, Jeff is sitting down talking with Mona Delfino. Mercury was in Scorpio, squared to Lilith in Aquarius, and they did 3 interviews: psychic transference, listening to your body, and listening to the wind. So I would summarize Mona's major theme here as saying it's about healing. And so with Lilith in the 6th house, we could see that's kind of the healing aspect of the interview. And but it's also talking about personal identity in the sense of that the self is permeable, okay? So the self can take in I guess the identity isn't rigid, so we don't have just like I am not my physical body, I am not my spirit. I'm somewhere in between. And then the third day where Jeffrey was doing interviews and Lilith was square with Mercury would have been 22nd of May 2019. Jeffrey was interviewing Debashish Banerjee, I believe is, yeah, Debashish Banerjee. And they did 4 interviews: Understanding the Rig Veda, Understanding the Upanishads, Understanding Posthumanism, and Yoga Psychology. And in that day, Mercury was in Gemini, so the thought and language power was very strong there. It was squared with Lilith in Pisces. So, and with those 4 interviews, I mean, Debashish, he just goes, basically I would call I would summarize his interviews in talking about yoga and the difference between yoga in India and in the West, and saying, I mean, yoga is a lot of things. It's a lot more than it's given credit for in the West in terms of you know, like say what Kate was talking about, enlightenment, you know, so yoga is a means to that, for instance. Mona was saying that people, one of the first things, and this is going back to, this is talking about with Lilith, and personal identity, that people detected the subconscious before the conscious. So it's a matter of, say, when we're making a first impression, for instance, that before we speak, before we let somebody know how we feel, there's certain signals that people can pick up on us, from us, and those are coming from our subconscious mind. And illness was the subconscious mind trying to get our attention. So the fact is that our subconsciousness was had greater powers than we typically give it credit for. And I mean, that's something that Kate Montana is talking about as well, saying that the higher self was more powerful than the physical self. So we'll have to see. Now Debashish, Understanding the Rig Veda, he's talking about the Soma hymns, and in that it's kind of demonstrating how desire emerged from one consciousness. And I mean, the idea of unity and oneness, it's really pervasive, really interesting. He's talking about the beginnings of yoga, which were the shamanistic cultures and practices that was around the middle of the 3rd millennium in before BC, or BCE, I guess we call it. So systems like astrology, they use not the numerical reality of one and everything. So this is kind of a more primitive way of looking at it, as say there's one consciousness, and we get our wants and our needs from that one consciousness, but instead we're looking at it like there's infinity, and we are getting our needs in kind of like one slice of that infinity. So it's kind of like more like a calculus, like a calculated way of looking at it, as opposed to saying, as opposed to the unified way of looking at it. So, in the Upanishads later on, after the Rig Veda, it's coming that the one was differentiated, coming to understand, but the one wasn't divided up, it was differentiated, and that was more like a understanding of direct knowledge. So Kate Montana is talking about this as well, and saying it's a very Mercury, Lilith in the 3rd house, and Mercury being Lilith in the 3rd house being squared with Mercury, that the inner and the outer membrane is, the duality there is going to be paralleled by the brain activity, mental activity that goes on in our mind. We're able to think, we're able to speak. And with that membrane, we're able to also block energy out, and sometimes that's to our detriment. And I think that's what she's saying, is that we block the energy out, and we don't get it. We don't get access to the higher self because we block that out. And that's because, in her opinion, and I think it's a great observation, that since we're born, the information that we've been getting is that we are a physical entity here on Earth. That's pretty obvious. That's pretty obvious to a baby, even. When you're crawling around, well, you're crawling on something. When you're sucking your thumb, you're sucking something, you know. And that we're separate. So we're not connected to all. We're not connected to all this. We have like this. It's kind of like what I call our skin. You know, I got like a unique name for it. I call it skin. You know, but yes, Kate is critical of there. And I don't know if my audience was around. I have an audience now. You know, I don't know if my audience was around. That's iffy. My audience was around when there was something called the spiritual materialist movement. Well, that's what they're calling it today, but at the time, you know, it was the secret to life, the universe, and everything, and it was, I don't know if that's what it was called, but might be mistaken that with life, the universe, and everything. But it's basically to do with thoughts, being positive thoughts, putting positive thoughts out there, and you're able to manifest these positive results in your life. And I mean, there must be something going on there that's not, it must not be working right, you know. It's not just a matter of dreaming, you know. There's got to be things, there's got to be, I guess, maybe work put into it, and that'll be, yoga encompasses that as well. We'll find Debashish speaks about that. So yeah, Mona is, she kind of more goes on about the fact that bringing negative energy inside the boundary of self. And so that's how we're critical of that spiritual materialist movement, because Mona insists that confrontation of that kind is good for the soul. So it's not, and Kate Montana lamented this, and I think that another brilliant observation, that under that spiritual materialist movement, you wouldn't permit yourself to have negative thoughts. And I mean, this is where it comes back. Of Mona, what she insists are the two main things. The two main it's kind of like the tactical, or how do we do it? How do we deal with when somebody's there, and we all have that friend, I guess, who's there and telling us they have all the worries in the world and everything is just horrible. And you know, how do we, I'm depressed, for instance, telling you how I'm depressed and all this, and it's like, how do we help them? So, or do we just kind of go through the motions, and it's kind of in one ear and out the other? So, Mona is saying that when somebody is there, and they might not be pouring their heart out to you, but you can pick up on negative things that are happening in your life, in their life, then that's it. When you're sitting down talking with your friend, having coffee, and you're picking up negative things from them that are going on in their life, that must be going on in their life, that's also a matter of learning from yourself, that there's something not right in your life as well. I mean, we're all, and this is saying that, what Kate Montana is saying, that the physical self is that separate It knows it's physical, it knows it's not connected, but the higher self, it knows that it's ethereal or immaterial, and it knows that it is connected and it does pervade everything, and that we want to get to that immaterial and that connected entity, as opposed to being stuck. I mean, whether we do or not, right? Or maybe we want to have mastery over both. Again, recognizing in our friend that we're sitting having coffee with that it's not a character. There's a disruption of their essence. It's not something that characterizes them. What's happening this time is not something that distinguishes them as an individual. It's something different. So she says that the first thing you do is that you recognize, and the second thing you do is it's important not to judge. So here we're in on this quandary right now. There's the idea of blocking out negative energy, but how do we know when that energy is negative before we block it out? You know, so we're blocking things out, but it could be a good thing. So this is where we have this disconnect here. And Mona says, yeah, but if you let that negative energy in, it's a learning process. You don't have to believe in it, but there's a certain way, and certain way what we do is we can shut it off, and we can find the things that we love about life. And a lot of times it's the release of old traumatic memories that are these negative characteristics that are coming through from our friends and from our co-workers, from our I didn't want to say co-workers, but from our friends, from our cohorts, let's call them, from people we know, from our I'm blanking on that word. Anyway, people that were acquaintances, that's the word. So she also speaks about it in terms of digesting, and it's kind of like, what are the things that what are things that are undigestible, right? So we have to find a way to deal with those. So Debashish, he's coming back and he's saying, you know, or actually he's just talking about, I think in the Upanishads, that where they had kind of detailed this, that duality was the realm of ignorance. And this was where we're getting the direct knowledge is differentiated from oneness, and duality was you had to infer the truth from duality. You couldn't experience it directly. And so I believe this is what he was considering was the aquaphotic teaching. And so aquaphotic teaching would be like that we were talking about stripping away the ego from the higher self. And the aquaphotic teaching, we strip away everything, and then what remains is our true self, and who we are truly, who we are really. Mona, she, in more than a dualistic sense, gives us her, I would call it a hierarchy of personal identity. So at the top would be spirit, at the so spirit, or what Kate Montana calls the higher self, or what Debashish calls Brahman. Secondly would be emotions, which is the heart, and the realm of the heart. And then thirdly would be mind, which were thoughts and language. So, and then fourth and closest to us would be the physical body. It's interesting because I guess we're not accounting there for the subconscious mind, which I guess would be part of the physical. I guess would be part of the mind. right? This is what I'm saying. There's no accounting for the subconscious mind. So the subconscious mind must be up there with emotions and spirit. Although if it's containing hidden memories, then it would be down there with the physical body. So, and what Kate Montana refers to as the personal self, as well as the aquaphatic teaching, which was stripping away everything, and what's left is who we are really. There's the cataphatic method, and it's a step-by-step kind of method which we can use to arrive at identity. So, and it's the more direct knowledge, to hear, to see, to focus on thought, and to arrive at identity. So it's a post-cognitive philosophy, and even Kate was talking about something similar to this, where we retrain our perception, and that's how we come to understand the higher self. And it was something called soft eyes. So I think it's kind of less the direct gaze, but it's a more holistic way of seeing. And even I know in the previous episode we were talking about that, about retraining the heart, and to retrain the heart in order to go from these intense emotions that tend to drive our irrational behaviors, and find a way to digest those and to process those intense emotions, so that it's just kind of a mood or a feeling that we can more easily cope with. Here is where the Upanishads were giving us a methodology to move from what was a ritual form of understanding that was more common, to a symbolic form of understanding which was more sophisticated. And there's a poem here, and it says that the one unmoving is swifter than thought. It moves, and it moves not. It is very close to us, and it is very far. And also, I should really have found that in my notes before now, talking about the Chariot. So the Chariot, I have it right here. The Chariot is, instead of looking at it as a hierarchy, we're looking at it as a vehicle. So the senses were the horses, and the sense mind were the reins, and the intelligence was the charioteer, and the rider was the self, which was also known as Atman. Ritual was a dramatization of psychological processes. And even the Judeo-Christian, this is from Devashish, the Judeo-Christian tradition, uses sacrifice imagery and sacrifice symbolism. So the ritual understanding was more common than the symbolic understanding. And so what happens is it moves from a mythical approach, to a proto-philosophical approach, and then the rigorous, when we're into today, the rigorous philosophy. Priestly rituals gave access to truth, and the self was differentiated from the masses. So that's where we're using symbols as a formulation for contemplation in the cataphatic method. And so here, this is where Devashish gives us kind of a formula for how to come into this higher self, which Kate Montana was lamenting. We weren't aware of our higher nature. Or she even says, no one understood that there was cosmic consciousness, transpersonal consciousness, the simultaneous awareness of everything. And in terms of what Mona Delfino gives as a hierarchy, Devashish, he calls those 4 different forms of consciousness. So at the top you have the spirit. Well, that would be, like we said, Brahman consciousness. And then there's the emotions. So that could be heart consciousness. And the mind, so that's mind consciousness, and body is physical consciousness. So there's all these different forms of consciousness. And the way that he talked, the method he's giving here, to really, he doesn't, well, it's called yoga psychology, I guess, is what the practitioners of clinical parapsychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies, they were part of the experimental process, and that made them scholar practitioners. And this, we're talking about like community-based participatory research, where the people who are participating, they have an interest in the outcome, and it's kind of departure from that strictly scientific way of saying, well, objectivity, I'm better off when I don't have, I'm better off not having a stake in the outcome. But we find that that's kind of a way for inferior research, because I mean, these are people that don't people doing the research that don't have any interest in what happens, right? They're just kind of going through the motion. So how are they listening to? How are they able to be objective when they have no interest? Debashish meant yoga to be a practice of ritual sacrifice, samu, which is avidya, as well as the union of the physical self, Atman, and the higher self, Brahman, vidya. And so he does say that. Out of the two come a third. Avidya was more connected to the earth, and it was the ritual sacrifice practices as well as the work ethic. And Samu refers to that kind of when we're doing work and we're able to find peace, really, at that time. And that's avidya. Whereas vidya was vidya is the soul that Kate Montana is talking about, saying how there's a personal self and a higher self, and that is body and spirit. So between the body and the spirit, combined with the ritual sacrifices and the work of, the body and the spirit are of heaven, almost like outer realms, not belonging to earth. Whereas the work and the ritual and the sacrifice, that all does belong to work, and when you belong to earth, and when you combine those two together, then we're talking, now we're cooking with gas sort of thing. Now we're talking about awareness of our higher nature, I guess. I mean, it's one of these things, it's like you can't really put your finger on it, you know. Mona has an interesting point as well, saying that she was in Hawaii and standing on the edge of a volcano, and she said the Ha prayer, and she was able to communicate with Pele, and the communication was part of education of the human race, and it was a communication to humanity. And so I guess to finish up, we'll talk about posthumanism that was discussed by Debashish. Let's see, Mercury was in Gemini in the 11th house, and that was squared to Lilith in Pisces, which was in the 8th house. So there's quite a bit of this transpersonal energy as well, and he's saying posthumanism is beyond transhumanism. Which is fine, as well as with Lilith in the 8th house, we're talking about kind of a resurrection, or like a phoenix rising out of the ashes, which is what posthumanism is really hoping for. And he calls us, we're the midwives of technology. So just to go through that quickly, and we'll wrap it up. Humanists believe man to possess the reason of God. And so this humanism and transhumanism is almost like the worship of reason. And so for transhumanism technology, where it does go through. It does use logic strictly, and so technology was almost the next evolution of humanity. And so posthumanism wants to recognize the dangers of considering technology as being the next stage of evolution of man. And I guess one of the criticisms he gives is that transhumanism would look at other cultures that were less rational as being inferior. But yet there's all these different forms of consciousness that don't necessarily subscribe to logic. And we don't want to see those perish just for the sake of greater technology. So it doesn't make sense. So yeah, that about brings it to a close. Thank you so much for listening. Maybe hope you have a good day, and all the best.